Scary Movies, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by McConnell. If you ask most people to visualize their happy place, they instantly conjure up images of yellow sands and palm-fringed beaches, sounds of the surf, blue sky, and sunshine. Or perhaps they see themselves sitting by a log fire, watching the snow falling and layering gently outside the window from the cozy insulation of their warm log cabin. Not Charlie. Asked to name his happy place, Charlie would disregard these cliched retreats in favor of somewhere altogether more unusual. Charlie's happy place was extremely specific, quite different, and considering his age at the time, somewhat inappropriate. His favorite location, the place where he felt the purest tingle of excitement and joy, was in the narrow stack rows of Wenzel's VHS rental store, in the horror section. Charlie had been my best friend since nursery school. We had laughed, cried, and fought together over the years, sharing each other's secrets and laughing at each other's jokes, all whilst teasing each other mercilessly, as adolescent boys always do. The thing I liked most about Charlie, though, the thing that really drew me to him and made me want to spend time with him, was when he became excited. Because Charlie's excitement was contagious. It didn't matter if it was an idea, a TV show, or a movie. When Charlie became excited by something, it was as if his whole being lit up like a beacon, his words becoming quick and rapid-fire whilst his face became red and flushed. It was as if that particular thing, whatever it happened to be, possessed him, and from the moment he encountered it, he could think of or focus upon nothing else. Not that this was a solitary or selfish pursuit that excluded others. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Part of the thrill for Charlie in these moments of excitement was the prospect of sharing whatever had got him going with other people, inviting them to join in the thrill, drawing them in with the gravity of his enthusiasm like a planet pulling asteroids into its orbit. Until, eventually, even if you had previously had not one iota of interest in the topic, you found that whatever had excited Charlie, pretty soon, started exciting you. In the early days of our friendship, it had been He-Man, and we had spent many hours watching the cartoons, playing with his Castle Grayskull action set, or running furiously around each other's houses and gardens with toy swords stuffed down our jumpers, shouting, "I have the power!" at every opportunity. A few years later, it was pro wrestling, a craze which at first I tried my best to resist. Initially, I found the whole thing corny, but after a few months of Charlie introducing me to the larger-than-life characters, the superhero headliners, and the dastardly villains, all played out like a live-action comic book, I was hooked. By the time WrestleMania rolled around that year, we were obsessed, sitting side by side, cross-legged on the floor and clutching our Hulk Hogan Bendham figures as we screamed at the screen, enraptured. By the age of 12, however, Charlie had found his real obsession, his happy place, in horror. When I asked him, he said that he couldn't remember specifically the first time he had slipped his mother's grip on his hand and wandered unattended into the horror section of the video store, but he did remember the feeling he got the first time he was in there. He described it as a mix of terror, anticipation, and a familiar, prickling, electric excitement. He recalled standing wide-eyed and staring up at the rows of beautifully grotesque covers, featuring nightmarish images painted in stark slashes of red and black. In some ways, it was less the films themselves than the actual cassette tapes, and in particular their boxes and the artwork on the covers, that enthralled him. Surrounded by these fascinating artifacts, the lurid colours and shocking visuals, Charlie had his kid in a candy shop moment, for a kid who never really liked candy. To him, these covers, which in the pre-Photoshop dark ages of the 1980s were hand-painted rather than manipulated from photographs on computers, seemed like darker and more dangerous comic books. He raved often about individual titles, describing in loving detail the fabulous beasts and monsters that peered out from the covers. werewolves with sprouting muzzles, the skin of their snouts crinkling as the lips drew back over fangs that jutted ever forwards. Beast-men covered in shaggy hair, with hands the size of shovels, tipped with razor-like claws, reaching out toward the viewer, whilst bald-headed goblins, slick with slime and ooze, grinned through rows of piranha-like teeth at once threatening and inviting, all of it horribly thrilling. Above, stylized lettering dripped down like blood from the frame. It took him only moments to realize he was in love. The week after this epiphany, he had begged his father to let him rent one of the movies, though the certificate said that he was at least 6 years too young. On that occasion, he had been denied and had been forced to content himself with the admittedly dark-tinged action of David Bowie prancing around in Labyrinth. Years later, I would look back with great affection on Jim Henson's creature effects for that film, but whilst they were creepy for most youngsters, Charlie still longed for another glimpse of the horror aisle, and more than that, to finally be allowed to take one of its manifold treasures home with him. It was 6 weeks later that Charlie finally made the breakthrough he needed. From age 12 upward, he had always rushed toward that section of the video store and had continued to beg his parents to no avail. But as weeks went by with no joy, he began to venture into the store either by himself or with me tagging along, always keen to show me new editions or hold lovingly in his hands one of his favourites, trying to memorize every detail. When alone, he had once secretly taken along his sketchbook and slinked into the aisle whilst the clerk was busy with a customer, had plonked himself down on the floor and proceeded to try to copy some of the images he saw with his pencil. The result wasn't great, but it did allow the clerk to notice his fascination with the genre, something that would come in handy the following week. On that night, Charlie and I, supposedly picking up the pizza we had ordered, spent 15 minutes longer than we should in the video shop next door. Strolling briskly past the new releases and cardboard cutouts of Stallone and Schwarzenegger, we headed straight for the main event and found the clerk, whom we knew only as Mikey, standing at the end of the aisle with a knowing look on his face. In his hand, he held one of the many lurid VHS boxes, though one that I had never seen before. He smiled a strange, sardonic grin before raising his eyebrows and saying, "You guys are a little young for this section, don't you think?" Scared that he was going to be told that he couldn't even look at the horror movies, Charlie started to panic. "We weren't doing anything. We're just looking. I mean, we're not going to rent one. We're not allowed, but—" Mikey interrupted. "You're not allowed? By who? Your parents?" Still, he smirked, showing his teeth now, adorned with 2 tracks of coloured braces. "I mean, they say you're not allowed, and the policy here says you're not allowed," Mikey mused. I saw Charlie's head begin to dip as he prepared to be banished from his happy place for good. Mikey went on as if mulling over his own words, tasting and assessing them as they left his mouth. "But your parents aren't here, and the policy is decided by the desk clerk, and of course that would be me." He added the last few words with a triumphant flick of his bottom lip that was at once confident and also somehow dangerous, using the same sort of vocal inflections you might expect from the snake in the Garden of Eden, only instead of the forbidden fruit, Mikey had tapes to offer. "You guys come here every Friday and you always have a pizza." We looked at each other and nodded, slightly perturbed that Mikey had been monitoring our movements quite so closely. Yeah, I began. "I usually stay over at Charlie's on a Friday, and his parents always let us get one from Piccolo's Pizza next door." I gestured toward the wall, as if Mikey wouldn't know which direction next door was. He nodded and again threw a knowing glance. He then looked away, and, in a gesture which I supposed was meant to indicate nonchalance, examined his fingernails, an action that would have been more convincing had he not already chewed them off earlier that day, so that he was now just staring at whittled, raw-looking remnants. "You think your folks would notice if you only went home with half a pizza?" Again, we looked at each other puzzled, before suddenly beginning to see where the conversation was headed. "We could tell them we ate most on the way home. They would never know," Charlie fired out, eager to strike a deal with this vendor of visual delights. "Well then, maybe next week you hand over half of your pizza and the price of the rental, and, the desk clerk might turn a blind eye to your age when you take a tape." I was gobsmacked. Charlie was ecstatic. "Wait, so if we bring the money and give you half, we can take what we want? Like anything?" Mikey nodded slowly. "You can take a few as long as you pay for them. I won't say anything if you won't. Just make sure the tape comes back by the following day." Charlie was glowing. For the next week, he wrote lists of titles, weighing up possible orders in which to watch the films and working out how to spend the combined total of our pocket money savings most wisely, hurriedly emptied from piggy banks. He also worked out, by way of scribbled calculations, that if we changed the variety of pizza we ordered from a 16-inch deep pan meat deluxe to a thin crust 14-inch plain margarita, then we could also use the money we saved to go towards another movie. Mikey had been watching our movements, but Charlie doubted that he knew the specific size or toppings we ordered, so the deception would work perfectly on him. It would mean less pizza for us, but that was no real issue, as there was always way more than enough available. We enthusiastically agreed to share a far smaller portion and decided that the deal was more than worth it. The following Friday we made our usual trip to Piccolo Pizza, but stopped Tony, the owner, from making our usual, and instead gave him our amended and far less costly alternative. "You guys going vegetarian or something?" he asked as he sprinkled the mozzarella onto the decidedly diminutive-looking pizza. "Something like that," Charlie confirmed. Once the pizza was ready, we asked Tony to cut it in half, but not slice it the way he usually would. That way we could easily transfer the half owed to Mikey and still keep the other half untouched. Then it was time for the main event. Charlie positively bounced as we made our way to the video store. He had already decided to tell his parents that the pizza took longer to prepare in order to allow himself time to peruse the options, but in truth he had already made his selections. Handing over the prized possessions to Mikey, along with half of the pizza, Charlie was surprised when he took the box and returned with 2 blank cassette boxes. "What's this?" he asked, holding the 2 white cassette boxes, emblazoned in one corner with the red Wenzel's VHS Library logo. Mikey sighed heavily. "It's a helicopter. The other one's an 18-wheeler articulated lorry." "What do you mean, what's this?" he responded sarcastically, unable to bring himself to speak to us on equal terms despite our deal and the fact that he was only a few years older. Charlie looked again in dismay at the blank covers. "Where's the box? The sleeve with the artwork. I mean, that's part of it." Mikey sucked on an enormous plastic cup full of Coke and shrugged. "They stay here. You only get the films themselves, doofus." Charlie looked back at me in desperation, as if he had paid for a rifle and been given a slingshot. "No, no way," he said finally. "I want the actual box, the sleeves with the artwork, the lot. Otherwise the deal ends now." Mikey raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Charlie's forthright stance and determination to press the issue. He considered for a moment and, looking down at his portion of our pizza, sighed heavily, took the cassette tapes back from Charlie and placed them into the original boxes. "Just don't damage the boxes. It's against policy to give out the proper sleeves." Charlie heeded the warning. Though realizing that this entire transaction was against company policy, he let the warning glide over him. He was far too interested in his newly acquired prizes to listen to anything Mikey had to say. To some extent, I could understand Charlie's insistence on taking the original sleeves home. For him, the whole thing was a complete package. It wasn't just about the movie itself, it was about the actual artifact. He wanted to take it home and savor the imagery that had drawn him to the films in the first place. That first night, we sat in the relative privacy of Charlie's basement room, knees pulled up to our chests, the pizza laid between us, and the remote control handy in case we had to quickly switch off the movie if interrupted. And we watched our first real horror movies together. That first night it was Creepshow and An American Werewolf in London, both of which became firm favourites of ours. For weeks after, Charlie would try to reproduce the artwork on the Creepshow cover, filling his sketchbook with juvenile but technically accomplished imitations of Bernie Wrightson's drawings. In some ways, it seemed that the artwork on the box held more fascination for him than the movie itself, and in fact, on a number of occasions over the coming weeks, we would agree that the film itself did not live up to the promise made by the cover art. Not that we were complaining. Our new, shared and secretive ritual became the highlight of our week. At school, during the week, we would discuss our favourite parts, critiquing the effects, the makeup, and the acting with surprising maturity. We were never actually frightened by the films at the time, beyond the few well-placed jump scares, or the thrilling tension experienced when watching. We knew that the monsters we saw on screen were just guys in prosthetics. We had both seen the making of Michael Jackson's Thriller, and reasoned that if makeup could turn Jacko into some kind of werecat, then Hollywood could turn anyone into virtually anything. That wasn't to say that the films didn't leave an impression, though. For it was afterwards, when we were apart and alone in the quiet of rooms or walking home in the dark, that the images and ideas on screen, now detached from their storylines and actors, came back to haunt us. In those moments, the rationalizing idea that they were simply actors in masks didn't help, because it didn't explain what those images were based on. Yes, they were men in masks, but what if the thing beneath my bed wasn't? The guy who stood outside the supermarket dressed as a bear to advertise Rice Puffs isn't really a bear, but that doesn't mean real bears don't exist, or that, if given the chance, a real bear might not actually maul and eat you. The same could be true of monsters. Of course, our fledgling male egos would never have allowed us to admit this to one another. Most times we would never admit that a particular monster or idea came back to prowl slowly behind us on the landings of our homes, that the beast with yellowed fangs seemed to peep out from that space behind the bathroom door that the light never reached. In front of anyone else, for example, I would never have admitted that at times the greatest terror in my daily existence was the stretch between the bottom of the stairs and the living room. That many times when my parents called me from upstairs, I would descend and shrink in fear when I saw that the hall light, the switch for which was on the other side of the hall, was off. Though the distance between the bottom step and the safety of the light and the living room door was only around 12 paces, that expanse, that walk taken through the pitch black, where untold terrors formed from an amalgam of monsters I should never have seen, monsters that could lurk and potentially jump out, snatch me up, dragging me away to be devoured and never seen again, filled me with horror. I would stand, perched on the bottom step, one hand on the light for the stairs, knowing that if I didn't flip it off as I stepped down, I would be told off by my father, but wishing I could leave it on. I would wait there and would hold my breath, knowing that as soon as I pushed it, the space both behind me and before me would be black, that I would invite every creeping, snarling thing to take its chance, to leap out and grip me in its curved talons. The only light, like a beacon bathing the shore, would be the light coming from around the edges of the living room door, towards which I would bound. Most times I ran, clearing that small hallway in just a few lightning-fast steps, and tumbling into the living room with unwarranted haste, always sure that some terror was snapping at my heels as I did. Once in the safety of the living room, I would be fine, and would walk to the sofa or dining table with exaggerated nonchalance, concealing from my oblivious family the terror I had experienced only moments earlier. A terror which, of course, I would never have admitted to having experienced at all. If accused of harbouring such childish and stupid imaginings and fears, I'd have laughed and balked at the idea. Most of the time. But then, of course, amongst friends, real friends, even adolescent male ones, there are those moments of crystalline honesty when even the deepest fears can be shared. Once I told Charlie that I still got scared, and he revealed that the same happened to him, though for Charlie it was once again the boxes rather than the films themselves that had the greater impact. He admitted one night, after we had finished watching Critters, that sometimes when he was alone in his windowless room, separated from the safety of the rest of the house by a flight of stairs that lay unreachable and impossibly remote on the other side of the room from his bed, he did, sometimes, feel nervous and even scared in the dark. He told me how once he had pulled the covers over his head and endured ridiculous amounts of heat, soaking his bedclothes in sweat, rather than lowering them even a fraction of an inch and making himself vulnerable to whatever was standing over him or lurking in the corner. He described the specific film titles and the individual creatures conjured from images on their covers that came to him in his room at night and threatened to grab his ankles or chew upon him whilst he screamed, unheard. I had thought that by sharing my fears with Charlie, admitting to sometimes being afraid of the dark, I would feel better. I didn't. Whoever said a problem shared is a problem halved was a very selfish person, never taking into account the fact that the listener might have problems of their own to share, and that if both parties exchange and reveal, their problems become the listener's problems too. A problem shared is sometimes a problem doubled. For the first time, I began to look around at the darker corners of Charlie's basement and imagine, as he had when alone, towering beasts watching with bulging eyes, dripping teeth, hanging just out of view. I could tell, as I did this, that talking about it and hearing my own stories of being scared had unnerved Charlie, and so, unbelievably, we calmed ourselves by watching another horror movie, the sanitized and approved realm of fantasy being an escape from the possibility of any real dangers. Not that these creeping fears put us off. Whereas some might have decided not to watch any more scary movies, we instead became hooked. Over the next 6 to 8 months, we devoured every horror title we could from that VHS store. Sometimes, when birthdays, Christmases, or generous relatives came around, we had a little more money and would stretch to 3 titles in one night. Waking inexplicably shattered on a Saturday morning, with Charlie's parents assuming that we had just stayed up all night, nattering as teenage boys are known to do. It wasn't until the 9th month of our arrangement that the real fear came. Fear that was not like those childhood fancies, but a cold, razor-sharp fear that cut through any surrounding reality or distraction and demanded attention in the present. We had decided to rent a movie called Cellar Dweller that Charlie had been eyeing for some time, and which seemed appropriate considering that with his basement room he was essentially a cellar dweller himself. For our second selection, however, we were torn, until Mikey, with a strange little whistle, called us over to the counter. For a horrible moment, we feared that he might be demanding more for his part in the deal, or, worse still, calling the whole bargain to an end. Instead, from under the desk, he produced a VHS tape that we had not only never noticed on the shelves before, but which we had never heard of at all. The cover, which curiously did not feature any text and therefore did not reveal the name of the film, was a beautifully painted and colourful scene worthy of any great horror comic artist. In some ways, it reminded me of the cover art for kids' movies like The Goonies or The Monster Squad, the protagonist being a boy in a red baseball cap, not much older than us, who was leaping out at the viewer from the centre of the composition. Behind him was an open closet door. We had got used to referring to these places as closets, despite the fact that to us they were always the less sinister-sounding cupboards. This closet was overflowing with creatures, each one more hideous than the next, that seemed to be clawing out like things clamouring to escape the jaws of hell. Every one of them had their eyes fixed on the boy, and reached with jagged claws and jutting fangs towards him, to grab, rend, and tear. The boy, whose mouth was fixed in a scream of abject horror, glared out pleadingly at the viewer, his arms raised in a desperate cry for help. We looked from the artwork to each other, and with a smiling nod, agreed that this was the one. "What's this one called?" Charlie asked as we handed over the pizza and payment. Mikey shrugged. "Beats me. I found it here on the countertop when I came into work today. No idea what's on it or even what it's called. The dumbasses at the film company have left the title off it, and there's no label on the tape itself. If you figure out what it's called when you watch it, then let me know and I'll write it up. I just thought it was the kind of thing you guys were into." It definitely was. Rushing home, we put aside Cellar Dweller, keen to find out what was on the mystery tape. After inserting the tape, however, Charlie did not press play. Instead, for several minutes he simply sat, cross-legged and staring at the image on the front of the tape. I was about to tease him for this, but glancing over, was myself drawn into considering the image again. It really was an amazing piece of work. My view of the piece began to be obscured, however, as the box began to shake in Charlie's trembling hands. I looked up from the cover and saw that Charlie had turned white. It's the same boy," he muttered, his lips hardly seeming to form the words as his mouth seemed determined to hang slackly open as his eyes stared wildly forwards, fixed on the cover. I looked again at the cover, thinking that perhaps he meant that the actor was someone we had seen in another movie. What I saw made me shrink back and recoil. I looked at it again, at the cover, at Charlie, and at the cover again. It didn't make sense. It was impossible. Contrary to what Charlie had muttered, it was not the same boy. In fact, the boy had changed completely. Whereas in the store, the figure in the center of the composition had been a boy wearing a red baseball cap with dark hair and glasses, screaming wildly, the image now showed a blonde little boy, with no hat, his hair half hidden by the massive clawed hand that was clamped around the cranium as if it were a basketball. I didn't know what to say. Just as I was trying to form words, to string together my confusion into a cogent sentence, Charlie leaped to his feet and sprinted up the stairs into his house. I dutifully followed, still stunned by what I had seen. It isn't the same boy, Charlie, it's changed," I shouted after him, but he wasn't listening. He ran to the kitchen table and, after some rummaging, came back with that week's local newspaper. The cover showed a photograph of a missing boy. The same missing boy. The same boy as was clearly depicted on the cover. There was no getting around it. It was like a photograph. Without speaking to me or his parents, without asking permission to go anywhere, Charlie grabbed his coat and ran out of the front door into the night, leaving it wide open for me to close behind him as I struggled to keep up. "Where are you going?" I screamed after him. "Wenzel's," was his breathless reply. Within 10 minutes we were rushing through the doors of Wenzel's VHS rental store. A clearly surprised-looking Mikey came out from behind the counter to meet us, but other than that, the store was empty, most viewers having selected their entertainment of choice far earlier in the evening. "What the hell are you clowns doing here?" Mikey spat, looking around nervously as if he were about to accuse him of something sinister. "Listen, it ain't my problem if the films gave you nightmares. You pay your money, you take your choice, no refunds." Without saying a word, Charlie held up the cover and the newspaper. Mikey initially looked confused and seemed about to make another dismissive comment, but then, as he squinted at the image, his face changed from one of cocky overconfidence to one of stunned confusion. "It's different. The picture. The picture, that's not what it looked like before." As he shook his head, we nodded ours. Eventually, we decided as a three that we needed to see what was on the tape. Mikey popped it into the VHS he kept by the counter. At first, it was just static. It seemed that the tape was blank. But then, an image danced onto the screen. Initially, it was just black. From somewhere off-screen, there was a low, jittering laugh, something like a hyena. Then, in the top portion of the screen, a light appeared. The image was a silhouette of someone sleeping. The only pale light source, the square of the window in the top third of the screen. There were low titters, then a voice, a child's voice, as the silhouette in the bed stirred, and the voice, clearly coming from that shifting shape in the bed, cried out, Who's there?" And after a moment, "Mummy? Is that you? Mummy? Mummy, I'm scared." Then came the horror. An explosion of sound, screams of terror and pain drowned out by furious thrashing and growling like a pack of wild dogs fighting over a hunk of meat. Then silence, and the image cut to static. We stood, silently watching the screen, none of us daring to vocalize what we thought we might have just seen. None of us daring to look back at the newspaper and the photograph. We left the tape there. We didn't go back to Wenzel's until 2 months later, and even then, it was only me. I had received a call at home, to the landline at my house. Expecting it to be Charlie on the other end, I rushed to the phone table in the hall by the door and picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was Mikey. "You need to come here. You need to come now." I tried to ask him what he was talking about, but got no response. So, unable to reach Charlie, though I called his house 3 times, I made my way to Wenzel's VHS. When I got there, I was surprised to find the store closed, but Mikey standing expectantly behind the glass door, peering out and clearly waiting for me. When he caught sight of me, he unlocked the door and ushered me hurriedly inside. Without saying a word, he reached under the counter and presented me with that same dreaded VHS tape. Reluctantly, I took it from him and stared at the cover, expecting, hoping, to see that same blonde boy that I had seen on there. Instead, I saw Charlie. There was no mistaking it. Every detail of his face was perfectly captured. It was Charlie. Not only that, but the background image had changed. Now, instead of a closet, the monsters were flooding from shadows around a set of stairs that led down into a basement room. I snatched the video from Mikey and without paying or saying a word, ran as fast as I could down the main street, across a blur of lawns and fences, past a seemingly never-ending stream of streetlights until finally I came to Charlie's door. I hammered on the front door like I was possessed. No one answered, although eventually a neighbor emerged and informed me that Charlie's parents had gone to the police station. Charlie was missing. I never saw Charlie again, and I never told anyone about the tape, especially Charlie's parents. Firstly, because I didn't think they'd believe me. Secondly, because if they did, and Charlie was already dead, they would watch the tape. Hear, or even perhaps see, their child torn to pieces by the things that emerge from the shadows. I didn't want that for them. Plus, there was no point. I could not have shown them the tape to verify my story. The same day I took it home, I built a small fire in the back garden and burnt the thing to ashes. I watched in tears as the paper burned and the curling plastic melted. I remember watching it shrivel and hoping beyond hope that this copy was the only one. This is only the second time I have told this story. The first time, the only other time, was to my wife around 10 years ago. I am telling it now because last week she found an article online that she thought might be relevant to my story. It was just your average, poorly researched clickbait article thrown together by some hack looking to make a few dollars, but the story itself chilled me. It concerned a man named Bernard Lawton. A comic book artist, he had worked primarily in horror comics, having produced some particularly detailed and lurid artwork for EC Comics and later for Creepy and Eerie. He also produced cover art for VHS releases of horror movies. In the early 1970s, he was committed to a psychiatric ward after having become convinced that the things he was painting in his work were real. He remained in the hospital for 17 years, during which time he continued to paint the same image over and over, covering his walls with splendidly detailed images all the same, except for the main character, who, though always a child pursued by monsters, would change in appearance with every version. Lawton died in 1986, the same year that Charlie disappeared. It seems he was somehow able to get hold of some matches and, using correction fluid and turpentine, to set himself alight. He burned to death in his cell before anyone could get in to rescue him. The article did not provide an exact date, but I have a feeling that in a back garden somewhere in England there was a videotape burning at the exact same time. Whilst on the ward, Lawton is said to have completed over 50 of these strange paintings, of which 13 were alleged to have been rescued from the fire. Having reached an almost mythical status, these 13 lost horrors are now considered to be a highly valuable holy grail by collectors of horror comic art and fans of the strange and macabre. Having read the article and heard about the search for these missing pieces, I can only say this: stop looking. Bernard Lawton's art, all of it, was sold to a single anonymous buyer years ago. That buyer spent his entire lump sum redundancy pay tracking down every last scribble from that man's wicked pen. The collection will never be displayed and will never go on sale. Period. The buyer, to this day, has always chosen to remain anonymous, though, cryptically, he has been quoted as saying that standing beside a roaring fire and watching evil burn is where he finds his happy place. This has been Scary Movies, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.